Tom Bradley hated going to town. After living alone on his mountain for 12 years, he'd grown used to the silence and peace. The only sounds he heard were birds singing, wind through the trees, and his own footsteps on the wooden floors of his small cabin. But his old pickup truck was making strange noises again. The engine coughed and wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. Tom knew he needed new parts, and the only place to get them was down in the valley at Murphy's Auto Shop. Teeing. Drive down the winding mountain road took 40 minutes. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel as he passed house after house. People were outside, talking to neighbors, kids playing in yards. All that noise and activity made his head hurt. He just wanted to get his truck parts and go home. At Murphy's shop, old Pete Murphy shook his head as he looked under the hood. "Tom, this engine's older than my grandson. I got the parts you need, but they won't be here till next week." Tom's heart sank. Another trip to town. He was about to leave when Pete mentioned something. "Hey, you know there's a livestock auction happening right now at the fairgrounds. Might be interesting to watch while you're here." Tom had never been to an auction before. He figured it was better than sitting in his truck for an hour, so he drove over to the fairgrounds. The parking lot was full of dusty pickups and trailers. Inside a big barn, folding chairs were set up in rows facing a small ring. The place was packed with farmers, ranchers, and families. Tom found an empty seat in the back corner away from everyone else. The auctioneer, a thin man with a loud voice, was selling cows. People held up numbered cards bidding on animals. Tom watched, fascinated despite himself. He'd forgotten how busy the world could be. Children ran around while their parents focused on the bidding. The smell of hay and animals reminded him of his childhood on his grandfather's farm before everything went wrong, before he decided to live alone. Hours passed. Tom found himself getting drawn into the excitement. When a beautiful horse came up for sale, he almost raised his hand to bid, but common sense stopped him. What would he do with a horse? The auction was winding down. Tom was getting ready to leave when the auctioneer's voice boomed over the microphone. "Folks, we got one last item today. This here's a special case." Two men led an enormous dog into the ring. Tom blinked hard, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. This wasn't just a big dog. It was massive. The animal stood almost as tall as a small pony with thick white fur that made him look even bigger. "This is Bruno," the auctioneer announced. "He's a Great Pyrenees mix, about 4 years old. His owner, Mrs. Henderson, passed away last month. Her family can't keep him because of his size. Now, I'll be honest with you folks. Bruno here weighs about 170 pounds. He's gentle as a lamb, but he needs someone with space and experience with large dogs." Tom stared at the giant dog. Bruno stood perfectly still in the ring, his head held high. His brown eyes seemed to be looking right at Tom, even from across the barn. There was something about those eyes. They looked sad but also hopeful. "He's house-trained, good with kids, and he's been to the vet recently," the auctioneer continued. "The family's asking for a starting bid of $100. Silence filled the barn. Tom looked around. People were shaking their heads, whispering to each other. A few folks got up and left. One woman pointed at Bruno and said loudly, "That's not a dog, that's a horse. Come on now, someone give me a bid," the auctioneer called out. His voice echoed in the barn. More people were leaving. "How about $75? Still nothing. Tom felt something strange happening in his chest. The dog just stood there, patient and dignified while everyone ignored him. It reminded Tom of himself. Unwanted, too big, too much trouble for most people. $50? The auctioneer tried again. His voice was getting desperate. "This is a purebred dog, folks. Someone's getting a great deal here." A few hands went up half-heartedly. "50? I got 50 from the gentleman in the blue shirt. Anyone give me 60? The bidding was slow. Most people seemed more interested in leaving than buying a giant dog. Tom found himself leaning forward in his chair, watching Bruno's face. The dog never moved, never whined or barked, he just waited. 60, 70, I got 70 from the lady in front, the auctioneer called out. Anyone give me 80? Silence again. Tom could see the family members who'd brought Bruno. They looked worried. A teenage boy kept checking his watch. A woman, who must have been Mrs. Henderson's daughter, was wiping her eyes. Going once for $70, the auctioneer announced. Going twice. Something made Tom raise his hand. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it. His hand just went up in the air. I got 80 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer shouted, his voice full of relief. Anyone give me 90? The barn was quiet except for a few whispered conversations. Tom's heart was beating fast. What was he doing? He lived alone for a reason. He didn't want company, especially not a dog the size of a small bear. 80 going once, going twice. The auctioneer paused, looking around the room. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $80. The crowd clapped politely. Tom sat frozen in his chair. Had he really just bought a giant dog? People were already leaving, heading for the parking lot. The Henderson family was walking toward him, smiling through their tears. Thank you so much, the daughter said, shaking Tom's hand. Mom would have been so happy to know Bruno found a good home. He's really the sweetest dog you'll ever meet. She handed Tom a folder full of papers, vet records, feeding instructions, Bruno's favorite, toys. He eats about 4 cups of food twice a day. He loves to walk, but he's not much of a runner, and he's scared of thunderstorms, so he might need extra comfort during bad weather. Tom nodded, taking in all the information. His hands were shaking slightly as he looked through Bruno's medical records. This dog had cost someone thousands of dollars in vet bills and food over the years. What had he gotten himself into? The barn was almost empty now. Tom walked slowly toward the ring where Bruno was waiting with one of the auction helpers. Up close, the dog was even more impressive. His head came up to Tom's chest, his paws were the size of small plates. Hey there, Bruno, Tom said quietly. The dog's tail wagged once, a gentle sweep that could have knocked over a small child. The auction helper, a kid who couldn't have been more than 16, looked relieved. He's been real patient all day, the boy said. Most dogs would be nervous, with all this noise and strangers, but Bruno here's been calm as anything. Tom reached out slowly to pet Bruno's head. The dog's fur was incredibly soft and thick. Bruno leaned into the touch just slightly, and Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection with another living being. You got a truck? The helper asked. He rides real good in truck beds. Mrs. Henderson used to take him everywhere. Leading Bruno out to the parking lot was an experience. The dog walked perfectly on his leash, never pulling or lagging behind. But everywhere they went, people stopped and stared. Kids pointed and asked their parents if it was really a dog. One little girl asked her mom if Bruno was a dog horse. Tom's pickup truck looked tiny next to Bruno. The dog waited patiently while Tom lowered the tailgate. With surprising grace for such a large animal, Bruno jumped up into the truck bed and lay down. As Tom drove out of the fairgrounds parking lot, he caught sight of Bruno in his rearview mirror. The big dog was sitting up, looking around at his new surroundings with interest rather than fear. His ears were up and his mouth was open in what almost looked like a smile. The drive up the mountain was quiet except for the truck's engine and the wind. Tom found himself glancing in the mirror every few minutes to check on Bruno. The dog seemed to be enjoying the ride, watching the trees and rocks go by. As they climbed higher, the air got cooler and the trees got thicker. This was Tom's world, wild, remote, and peaceful. He wondered what Bruno would think of it. Would a dog who'd lived in town be happy on a mountain? Would he be scared of the wildlife sounds at night? When they finally reached Tom's cabin, it was getting dark. Tom parked the truck and sat for a moment looking at his small wooden house. He'd built most of it himself, one room at a time. It was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and windows that looked out over the valley below. Bruno jumped down from the truck and stood beside Tom, both of them looking at the cabin. For 12 years, Tom had walked up to this door alone. Tonight, for the first time, he had company. Well, Bruno, Tom said, his voice sounding strange after hours of silence. Welcome home, I guess. The big dog looked up at him with those gentle, brown eyes and wagged his tail once. In that moment, Tom realized his quiet, solitary life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The first night was harder than Tom expected. Bruno whined softly at the cabin door for hours, probably missing his old home and family. Tom lay in his small bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another living creature in his space. Every time Bruno shifted his massive body on the living room floor, the wooden planks creaked. Tom had lived alone for so long that even the sound of someone else breathing felt strange. He'd forgotten how different it was to share space with another being. Around midnight, when Bruno finally settled down, Tom managed to fall asleep. He woke up to find Bruno sitting by his bed, just watching him. Those big brown eyes were patient but alert, as if the dog had been waiting politely for Tom to wake up. It was unsettling and somehow comforting at the same time. "You need to go outside?" Tom asked, pulling on his boots. Bruno's tail wagged once, and he walked to the door. Tom let him out, watching as the giant dog carefully explored the area around the cabin. Bruno sniffed everything: the porch steps, the wood pile, the old oak tree where Tom sometimes sat in the evenings. But something was wrong. Every small sound from the forest made Bruno's ears perk up nervously. When a squirrel chattered in a nearby tree, the big dog actually backed up toward the cabin. This was strange behavior for such a large animal. Over the next few days, Tom realized that Bruno was actually afraid of the mountain. The dog had lived his whole life in town, where the loudest sounds were cars and lawnmowers. Up here, owls hooted at night, coyotes howled in the distance, and branches creaked in the wind. All of these natural sounds terrified poor Bruno. The first week was frustrating for both of them. Bruno refused to walk more than 20 feet from the cabin. He would start to explore, then hear a bird call or see a shadow move, and he'd hurry back to Tom's side. For such a big, strong-looking dog, he was surprisingly timid. Tom found himself talking to Bruno more than he'd talked to anyone in years. At first it felt awkward. He'd spent so long in silence that his own voice sounded rusty and unfamiliar. "It's just a woodpecker, boy," he'd say when Bruno jumped at the rat-a-tat-tat of a bird on a dead tree. "Nothing to worry about." Or when Bruno cowered at the sound of wind through the pine trees. "That's just the mountain talking to itself. Been doing it long before we got here." Slowly, something interesting started happening. As Tom explained the mountain sounds to Bruno, he began to hear them differently himself. He'd lived up here so long that he'd stopped really listening. Now, seeing everything through Bruno's eyes, Tom remembered how amazing and alive the mountain actually was. Bruno was incredibly smart. Tom noticed it right away. The dog seemed to understand not just commands but whole conversations. When Tom mentioned going to check the water pump, Bruno would head toward the pump house. When Tom said something about firewood, Bruno would look toward the wood pile. But the most surprising thing was how Bruno seemed to sense weather changes. 3 days after arriving, Bruno became restless around noon, pacing and whining softly. Tom couldn't figure out what was wrong. The sky was perfectly clear, not a cloud anywhere. But Bruno kept going to the windows, looking outside with concern. He wouldn't eat his dinner and seemed anxious about something Tom couldn't see or hear. Around 8 that evening, storm clouds started building over the western peaks. By 10 o'clock, they were in the middle of a thunderstorm that came out of nowhere. Bruno had somehow known it was coming 6 hours early. "How did you know that?" Tom asked, scratching behind Bruno's ears as rain pounded the cabin roof. The big dog was trembling slightly. Apparently his fear of thunderstorms was real, but he seemed proud that Tom had noticed his prediction. After that, Tom started paying attention to Bruno's weather sense. It was uncanny. The dog could predict rain, snow, and wind changes with accuracy that amazed Tom. Living on a mountain, knowing what weather was coming could be a matter of life and death. Bruno was turning out to be better than any weather forecast. As the weeks passed, both of them settled into new routines. Tom discovered that Bruno was an excellent listener. After years of keeping his thoughts to himself, Tom found himself sharing things with the dog that he'd never told another soul. He told Bruno about his life before the mountain, how he'd worked in the city as an engineer, how stress and disappointment had slowly eaten away at his happiness until he couldn't stand being around people anymore. He talked about building the cabin with his own hands, learning to live off the land, finding peace in solitude. Bruno never judged or interrupted. He just listened with those intelligent eyes, sometimes resting his massive head on Tom's lap while they sat by the fireplace in the evenings. The dog was also changing. His fear of forest sounds was slowly fading. Tom's calm explanations and patient presence were teaching Bruno that the mountain wasn't dangerous. It was just different from town life. One morning, about a month after Bruno's arrival, Tom woke up to find the dog wasn't in the cabin. His heart jumped with worry. Had Bruno run away? Was he lost in the wilderness? Tom rushed outside and found Bruno about 50 yards from the cabin, sniffing around a fallen log. The big dog looked up when he saw Tom, his tail wagging proudly. He'd finally worked up the courage to explore on his own. "Good boy," Tom called out, relief flooding through him. He was surprised by how panicked he'd felt at the thought of losing Bruno. Somewhere over the past month, the giant dog had become more than just a responsibility. He'd become a companion. Bruno started joining Tom on his daily walks around the property. At first, the dog stayed close, but gradually he began to range farther out, always keeping Tom in sight. His confidence was growing. Tom's daily routine had completely changed. Instead of long silences, he found himself narrating his activities for Bruno's benefit. "Time to check the solar panels," he'd say, and Bruno would follow him to the small array that powered the cabin. "Let's see if any trees came down in last night's wind," and Bruno would accompany him on patrol walks. The dog seemed genuinely interested in everything Tom did. When Tom worked on small repairs around the cabin, Bruno would lie nearby, watching with attention that felt almost human. When Tom cooked, Bruno would sit in the kitchen doorway, not begging for food, but simply keeping him company. Fall was coming to the mountain. The aspen leaves were turning golden and the nights were getting colder. Tom realized he was looking forward to winter for the first time in years. Having Bruno's warm presence in the cabin would make the long, snowy months less lonely. But Bruno was full of surprises. One evening in late September, Tom was splitting firewood behind the cabin when Bruno suddenly stood up and stared intently at the forest. His body was tense, alert, but not afraid. This was different from his earlier fear responses. Tom followed Bruno's gaze but couldn't see anything unusual. The dog walked to the edge of the clearing and stood perfectly still, like a statue. After a few minutes, Tom saw movement in the trees, a deer stepping carefully through the underbrush. Bruno watched the deer with fascination, but made no move to chase or bark. He simply observed, showing a respect for wildlife that impressed Tom. This wasn't the behavior of a city dog anymore. Bruno was adapting to mountain life, learning to be part of the natural world rather than afraid of it. That night, as they sat by the fire, Tom realized something had fundamentally changed in his life. For 12 years, he'd chosen isolation because people were too complicated, too demanding, too unpredictable. But Bruno was none of those things. The dog was peaceful, understanding, and somehow perfectly suited to Tom's quiet lifestyle. More than that, Bruno seemed to bring out a part of Tom that had been buried for years, his capacity for caring about someone other than himself. He found himself checking on Bruno throughout the day, making sure the dog had fresh water, worrying if Bruno seemed tired or out of sorts. The strangest part was that it didn't feel like a burden. Taking care of Bruno felt natural, even enjoyable. Tom was discovering that maybe he hadn't wanted to be alone forever. Maybe he'd just been waiting for the right companion. As winter approached, Tom started preparing the cabin for 2 residents instead of 1. He bought extra blankets, stocked up on more food, and even built a comfortable sleeping area for Bruno near the fireplace. The dog had earned his place in the home, and Tom wanted to make sure he was comfortable through the cold months ahead. Looking back on that day at the auction, Tom couldn't believe how much his life had changed. He'd thought he was just buying a dog. Instead, he'd found a partner, a friend, and a reason to talk again. Bruno had brought something back to life in Tom that he'd thought was gone forever, his connection to another living being, and winter on the mountain would give them both a chance to find out just how strong that connection had become. October came with an unusual warmth that worried Tom. He'd lived on the mountain long enough to know that late-season heat often meant trouble was coming. The trees seemed to sense it too. Their leaves were changing faster than normal, as if they were rushing to prepare for something. Bruno felt it as well. The big dog had been restless for days, pacing around the cabin and staring at the sky with concern. His weather-sensing abilities had only gotten stronger over the months, and Tom had learned to trust the dog's instincts completely. On October 23rd, Bruno's anxiety reached a new level. He refused to eat his morning food and kept going to the windows, looking out at the clear blue sky with obvious worry. Tom checked the weather radio, but the forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures for the rest of the week. "What is it, boy?" Tom asked, scratching behind Bruno's ears. "You seeing something I'm not?" Bruno looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes, then walked to the door and whined softly. It was his signal for something important, and Tom had learned not to ignore it. By afternoon, the temperature had started dropping. Not gradually, like normal weather changes, but fast and hard. Tom watched his outdoor thermometer fall from 65 degrees to 40 in just 2 hours. That wasn't natural. Bruno became more agitated as the day went on. He followed Tom everywhere, pressing close to his legs like he used to do when he was still afraid of the mountain sounds. But this wasn't fear. This was warning. Around 5 o'clock, Tom saw the first clouds building over the western peaks. They were dark and heavy, moving faster than any storm clouds he'd ever seen. The wind started picking up, making the pine trees sway and creak. "Okay, Bruno," Tom said, understanding now. "You were right. We're in for something big." Tom spent the evening securing everything around the cabin. He brought in extra firewood, checked his emergency supplies, and made sure his generator was fueled and ready. Bruno followed him through every preparation, still anxious but seeming calmer now that Tom was taking action. By 10 o'clock, the first snowflakes started falling. But these weren't gentle, lazy flakes. They came down hard and fast, driven by winds that howled through the trees like living things. Tom had seen plenty of mountain storms, but this one felt different from the start. The power went out around 11. Tom lit some candles and started a fire in the fireplace, more for light, then warmth. Outside, the wind was getting stronger, shaking the cabin walls and making sounds he'd never heard before. Bruno positioned himself by the front door, lying down but staying alert. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head and listen to something. Tom couldn't hear. The dog's behavior was starting to make Tom nervous. In all their months together, he'd never seen Bruno this focused on something outside. By midnight, the storm was unlike anything Tom had experienced. The wind was so strong, it sounded like a freight train rushing past the cabin. Snow was falling, so thick and fast that Tom couldn't see his truck, which was parked just 20 feet away. He was getting ready for bed when Bruno suddenly stood up and started whining. Not the soft, worried whine he'd been making all day. This was urgent, almost desperate. "What's wrong now?" Tom asked, but Bruno was already at the door, pawing at the wooden panels. The big dog looked back at Tom, then at the door, then back at Tom again. His message was clear. They needed to go outside. "Bruno, it's a blizzard out there," Tom said. "We're not going anywhere tonight." But Bruno wouldn't give up. He kept whining and pawing at the door, looking more desperate by the minute. He walked over to where Tom kept his winter coat hanging on a peg and actually pulled it down with his teeth, bringing it to Tom. This was new behavior. Bruno had never demanded anything from Tom before. The dog was always patient, always willing to wait. Whatever was happening outside, Bruno believed it was important enough to risk the storm. Tom looked out the window but couldn't see anything through the swirling snow. The wind was so loud it drowned out every other sound. But Bruno was insistent, and Tom had learned to trust the dog's instincts. "All right, boy," Tom said finally, "but this better be important." He put on his heaviest winter coat, boots, and gloves. Bruno waited by the door, trembling with anxiety but determined. When Tom opened the door, The wind nearly knocked him over. Snow immediately stung his face and filled his eyes. Bruno pushed, passed him into the storm, then looked back to make sure Tom was following. The dog seemed to know exactly where he was going, even though visibility was almost zero. Fighting through snow that reached his knees, Tom followed Bruno's dark shape into the night. The cold was brutal, and the wind made it hard to breathe. Every instinct told him to turn back to the warm cabin, but Bruno kept moving forward with purpose. They were heading down the mountain road, which seemed crazy. The road was treacherous enough in good weather. In a blizzard like this, it was suicide. But Bruno pressed on, using his size and strength to plow through the deep snow. Tom lost track of time. It felt like they'd been walking for hours, but it might have been 20 minutes. The storm was so intense that all sense of direction and distance disappeared. He was following Bruno blindly, trusting that the dog knew what he was doing. Then Bruno stopped suddenly. He stood perfectly still, his head raised, listening to something. Tom strained to hear over the wind but caught nothing. Bruno moved forward more carefully now, stepping slowly through the snow. That's when Tom saw it. A dark shape in the white wilderness that shouldn't have been there. It was too regular, too geometric to be natural. As they got closer, Tom realized with horror what they'd found. It was a car, flipped completely upside down in the ditch beside the mountain road. The vehicle was already half buried in snow, and if the storm continued like this, it would be completely invisible by morning. "Oh no," Tom breathed, his words lost in the wind. Bruno was already at the car, digging frantically at the snow around, the driver's side. Tom stumbled through the deep snow to join him, his heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. Through the broken windshield, Tom could see movement inside. People were trapped in there. In this cold, in this storm, they wouldn't survive until morning. Tom knocked on the metal roof of the upside-down car. "Hello, can you hear me?" A weak voice answered from inside. "Help us, please, we have kids." The desperation in that voice cut through Tom like a knife. He looked at Bruno, who was still digging at the snow, trying to clear a path to the car doors. The dog had known. Somehow Bruno had sensed that people were in trouble and had led Tom through a deadly blizzard to find them. "How many of you are there?" Tom shouted over the wind. "4," came the reply. "My wife and 2 kids. My wife's hurt." Tom's mind raced. 4 people, including children and an injured woman, trapped in an upside-down car in the worst storm he'd ever seen. They were at least half a mile from his cabin, maybe more. The temperature was dropping fast and the wind was getting stronger. But looking at Bruno, who was working tirelessly to clear snow despite his own exhaustion, Tom knew they had to try. The dog had brought him here for a reason. These people were going to die if he and Bruno didn't help them. "We're going to get you out," Tom yelled to the people in the car. "Just hang on." He started digging alongside Bruno, using his hands to move snow away from the car doors. The metal was already ice cold to the touch. Inside, he could hear crying, children's voices, scared and confused. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Tom had lived alone on his mountain for 12 years, avoiding people and their problems. Now he was in the middle of a life-and-death situation with strangers he'd never met, led there by a giant dog who somehow understood that help was needed. As he worked to free the trapped family, Tom realized that his quiet, isolated life was about to become something completely different. Bruno had found them, but now they had to figure out how to save them. And in weather like this, that was going to require every ounce of strength, intelligence, and courage that both man and dog possessed. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. But Tom looked at Bruno, still, digging faithfully beside him, and knew they weren't giving up. These people were going to live no matter what it took. The night that changed everything was just beginning. Getting the car doors open was the first nightmare. The vehicle had landed upside down and snow was packed around it like concrete. Tom and Bruno worked together, with Tom digging and Bruno using his massive paws to push snow away from the car. The wind was so strong it kept filling in their work almost as fast as they could clear it. Tom's fingers were going numb despite his gloves, and Bruno's thick fur was becoming heavy with ice. But neither of them stopped. When Tom finally got the passenger door partially open, he could see inside the overturned car. A man in his 30s was hanging upside down from his seatbelt, conscious but clearly in pain. Next to him, a woman was unconscious, blood on her forehead from where she'd hit something during the crash. In the back seat, 2 small children were crying. A little girl who looked about 6 was trying to comfort a younger boy, maybe 4 years old. Both kids were scared out of their minds, hanging from their car seats in the darkness. "Are you hurt?" Tom shouted to the man over the storm. "My shoulder, I think it's broken," the man replied. "But my wife hit her head hard. She won't wake up. And the kids." Tom could hear the panic in the father's voice. This family had been driving somewhere when the storm hit. They'd probably tried to make it down the mountain and lost control on the icy road. "What are your names?" Tom asked, trying to keep the man focused. "I'm David, my wife is Lisa, the kids are Katie and Ben." "Okay, David, I'm Tom. This is Bruno. We're going to get you all out of here, but I need you to stay calm." Tom assessed the situation quickly. The father had a broken shoulder but was alert. The mother was unconscious and possibly seriously injured. Moving her wrong could make things worse. The children were scared but seemed physically okay. The biggest problem was the cold. The car had no heat, and the broken windows were letting snow blow inside. In these temperatures, hypothermia would set in fast, especially for the kids. Bruno seemed to understand the urgency. While Tom worked on getting David free from his seatbelt, the big dog positioned himself near the broken window where wind and snow were coming in. His massive body blocked most of the cold air, creating a small shelter for the family. Getting David out was brutal. Every movement sent pain through his broken shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and let Tom guide him through the car door. Once outside, David immediately wanted to help get his family out. "Your shoulder's broken," Tom said. "You'll just hurt yourself more and slow us down. Let me handle this." The children came next. Tom had to crawl partially into the upside-down car to reach them, working carefully to unbuckle their car seats. Little Katie was brave, following Tom's instructions exactly, but Ben was too scared to move. That's when Bruno did something amazing. The big dog stuck his head through the broken window and made a soft, gentle sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, just a calm, reassuring noise. Ben stopped crying and stared at Bruno's enormous, kind face. "That's Bruno," Tom told the boy. "He's the one who found you. He's going to help keep you warm." Ben reached out with a tiny hand and touched Bruno's nose. The dog stayed perfectly still, letting the frightened child pet his face. Within minutes, Tom had both children out of the car. Lisa was the hardest. She was still unconscious, and Tom was terrified of moving her wrong. But leaving her in the freezing car wasn't an option. He had to take the risk. As carefully as possible, Tom eased Lisa out of the car. She was breathing, but her pulse was weak. Blood from her head wound had frozen on her face. She needed medical attention fast, but the nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and no ambulance was getting up this mountain in the current storm. Now came the real challenge: getting this injured family back to Tom's cabin through half a mile of deep snow and howling wind. David could barely walk with his broken shoulder. Lisa was unconscious and would have to be carried. The children were already shivering uncontrollably. Tom looked at the situation and realized it was nearly impossible. He was strong, but he couldn't carry an unconscious woman and help 2 small children through a blizzard. David was injured and couldn't help much. But Bruno seemed to have a plan. The big dog moved over to where the children were huddled together and lay down in the snow. His message was clear: climb on. Katie and Ben looked at Tom with uncertainty. "Bruno wants to help carry you," Tom explained. "He's really strong and his fur will keep you warm." Getting the children onto Bruno's back was like putting them on a gentle living sled. The dog stood up carefully, making sure both kids had good grips on his thick fur. Katie put her arms around Ben to keep him secure. Now Tom could focus on Lisa. He fashioned a makeshift sled using branches and his jacket, then carefully placed the unconscious woman on it. David, despite his broken shoulder, helped Tom drag the sled through the snow. The journey back to the cabin was the longest half-mile of Tom's life. The snow was now knee-deep and the wind was so strong it sometimes knocked them off balance. But Bruno led the way, moving slowly and carefully with the two children on his back. Every few minutes, Tom had to stop and check on Lisa. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was getting pale. Hypothermia was setting in. They were racing against time. Bruno seemed to understand the urgency. Despite carrying two children through deep snow, the dog never faltered. He broke trail for the humans, using his size and strength to make a path they could follow. Halfway back, little Ben started crying again. He was cold and scared, and the wind was frightening him. Bruno stopped walking and turned his massive head to look at the boy. Then he started making that gentle, comforting sound again, a low, rumbling noise that somehow cut through the storm. Ben stopped crying and pressed his face against Bruno's warm fur. Katie whispered something to her little brother, and both children settled down. The dog had calmed them when nothing else could. When Tom's cabin finally came into view through the blowing snow, he nearly cried with relief. But getting everyone inside and warm was just the beginning. Lisa was still unconscious and needed immediate medical attention that Tom couldn't provide. Once inside, Tom got the fire blazing and wrapped the children in every blanket he had. Bruno lay down next to them, sharing his body heat. David sat nearby, cradling his broken shoulder but focused entirely on his unconscious wife. Tom tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out phone lines and cell towers. His radio could reach the valley, but he doubted any rescue vehicles could make it up the mountain in these conditions. For the next 6 hours, Tom did everything he could to keep Lisa stable. He had basic first aid training from his years living alone, but head injuries were beyond his expertise. All he could do was keep her warm and hope she would wake up. Bruno never left the children's side. The big dog seemed to understand that Katie and Ben needed constant comfort. When they cried, he nuzzled them gently. When they fell asleep, he positioned himself to keep them warm. Dawn finally came, gray and cold. The storm was still raging, but it seemed less intense than during the night. Tom managed to reach the sheriff's department on his emergency radio. "This is Tom Bradley up on Pine Ridge," he said into the radio. "I've got a family up here, car accident victims. One adult with a head injury needs immediate medical attention." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static. "Tom, we've got rescue teams ready to go, but the roads are completely blocked. Visibility is near zero. Can you hold tight until this weather clears?" Tom looked at Lisa, still unconscious on his couch. "How long before you can reach us?" "Maybe 6 hours if we're lucky. The storm's supposed to move through by this afternoon. 6 more hours." Tom wasn't sure Lisa could wait that long, but there was nothing else they could do except wait and hope. Around noon, something wonderful happened. Lisa opened her eyes. She was confused and in pain, but she was conscious. Her first words were asking about her children. "They're right here," Tom said, helping Katie and Ben climb onto the couch next to their mother. "Bruno kept them warm and safe all night." Lisa looked at the giant dog lying nearby and tears filled her eyes. "He saved us, didn't he?" Tom nodded. "Bruno found you in the storm. Without him, we never would have known you were out there." The rescue team finally reached them that afternoon. Paramedics checked everyone over and said that Lisa had a concussion, but would recover fully. David's shoulder needed surgery but wasn't life-threatening. The children were cold and scared but physically fine. As the family was loaded into the rescue vehicles, little Katie ran back to Bruno and threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you for saving us," she whispered into his fur. Ben followed his sister, giving the big dog a gentle pat on the head. "Good dog," he said solemnly. David shook Tom's hand with his good arm. "I don't know how to thank you. You and Bruno saved our lives." "Bruno did the hard work," Tom replied. "I just followed him." As the rescue vehicles disappeared down the mountain, Tom and Bruno stood in the doorway watching them go. The storm was finally ending and patches of blue sky were showing through the clouds. Tom looked down at his giant companion, who was calmly watching the last of the vehicles disappear around a curve. "You knew, didn't you? You knew they were out there." Bruno looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes and wagged his tail once. Within hours, the story was all over local news. Mountain Man and Giant. The phone calls started the day after the rescue. Tom's landline, which had been silent for months at a time, suddenly rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews, the county sheriff wanted to talk, and most surprisingly, the Peterson family, the people they'd saved, called to check on Bruno and thank them again. Tom wasn't comfortable with all the attention. He'd lived alone for 12 years specifically to avoid this kind of thing. But Lisa Peterson was insistent that she and her family come visit as soon as the roads were clear. "My children ask about Bruno every day," she told Tom over the phone. "They want to see the hero dog again. Would that be okay?" Tom looked at Bruno, who was lying by the fireplace, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "I guess that would be fine," Tom said, though the idea of having visitors made him nervous. The Peterson family arrived the following weekend, bringing homemade cookies and a new collar for Bruno. Little Katie and Ben ran straight to the giant dog, who greeted them, like old friends. Watching Bruno gently interact with the children, Tom realized something had changed in the dog too. He seemed more confident, more purposeful than before. "He's incredible," David Peterson said, watching Bruno let Ben climb on his back for a ride around the cabin. "Have you ever thought about training him for search and rescue work?" Tom hadn't thought about it, but the idea stuck with him after the family left. Bruno clearly had natural abilities that went beyond weather prediction. The dog's calm temperament, intelligence, and incredible sense of smell made him almost perfectly suited for rescue work. A week later, Tom got a call from Captain Rodriguez of the county search and rescue team. "Mr. Bradley, I've been following the story about you and your dog. We could really use someone with Bruno's abilities on our team." "I don't know anything about search and rescue," Tom protested. "But you know your dog, and you know these mountains better than anyone," Rodriguez replied. "We'd provide all the training. Both of you would learn together." Tom was hesitant. Joining a rescue team meant working with other people regularly, something he'd avoided for over a decade. But when he looked at Bruno, he remembered how purposeful the dog had seemed during the rescue. Maybe this was what they were meant to do. The first training session was awkward for Tom. He hadn't been around groups of people in years, and he felt out of place among the other volunteers. But Bruno took to the training immediately. The dog seemed to understand that this was serious work, not play. Search and rescue training involved teaching Bruno to follow specific scent trails, to alert when he found someone, and to work calmly in chaotic situations. But Bruno already knew most of what they were trying to teach him. His natural instincts were better than what most dogs achieved after months of training. "Your dog is remarkable," said Janet, the team's lead trainer. "I've never seen a natural talent like this." What surprised Tom most was how much he enjoyed working with the team. These weren't city people trying to make small talk. They were serious, focused individuals who shared his love of the mountains and his desire to help others. Slowly, Tom began to feel comfortable around them. The team's first call with Tom and Bruno came just 3 weeks after they started training. A teenage hiker had gone missing on Pine Ridge, not far from Tom's cabin. The boy had been gone for 8 hours in freezing temperatures. Bruno found him within 40 minutes. The teenager had fallen into a small ravine and twisted his ankle. He was cold and scared, but alive. Bruno located him by scent trail and alerted the team with a distinctive bark they'd taught him. The rescue was smooth and successful. Word of Bruno's abilities spread quickly through the search and rescue community. Other teams began asking to borrow him for difficult cases. In his first year, Bruno participated in 11 successful rescues, finding lost hikers, elderly people with dementia who had wandered off, and even a child who had gotten separated from his family during a camping trip. Each rescue taught Tom something new about his remarkable dog. Bruno could track scents that were hours old, work in terrible weather conditions, and remain calm in situations that would panic most animals. But more than that, Bruno seemed to genuinely care about finding people. The dog worked with an intensity and focus that amazed everyone who saw him. The changes in Tom were just as dramatic. Working with the rescue team had forced him to interact with people regularly, and he discovered that he'd actually missed human companionship more than he'd realized. The team members respected his expertise about mountain conditions, and he found himself becoming a valuable resource for planning rescues in difficult terrain. The Petersons became regular visitors to the cabin. Katie and Ben loved spending time with Bruno, and their parents enjoyed talking with Tom about mountain life. Other rescue team members started stopping by as well, and Tom's cabin became an unofficial gathering place for people who loved the mountains. For someone who had once avoided all human contact, Tom was now surrounded by friends. The irony wasn't lost on him. The dog he'd bought impulsively at an auction had not only become his best friend, but had also brought him back to the world of human relationships. Bruno's fame continued to grow. The local newspaper wrote articles about the wonder dog of Pine Ridge. A television crew came up to film a segment about Bruno's rescue work. The story was picked up by national news networks, and suddenly people from around the country were calling to ask about Bruno. Tom was uncomfortable with the media attention, but he recognized that Bruno's story was inspiring people. Letters arrived from children who wanted to be search and rescue workers when they grew up. Dog trainers asked for advice about developing natural abilities in their animals. Other mountain communities wanted to know how to start their own search and rescue programs. The most meaningful recognition came from the state governor, who presented Bruno with an official commendation for his service to the community. The ceremony was held at the state capitol, and Tom had to wear his best shirt and drive down from the mountain for the event. Standing on the capitol steps with Bruno beside him, Tom reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 2 years earlier, he'd been a hermit who spoke to no one for days at a time. Now he was part of a community, surrounded by friends, and recognized throughout the state for the work he and Bruno did together. But the real transformation wasn't in the recognition or fame. It was in how Tom felt about his life. The loneliness and bitterness that had driven him to the mountain were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection that he'd never experienced before. Bruno had given him more than companionship. The dog had given him a reason to engage with the world again. Every rescue reminded Tom that people needed help, and that he had something valuable to offer. His knowledge of the mountains, combined with Bruno's extraordinary abilities, made them uniquely qualified to save lives. The cabin was different now, too. Instead of the silence Tom had once treasured, it was filled with the sounds of friendship and community. Rescue team members stopped by to plan operations. The Peterson children visited to play with Bruno. Other dog owners came to ask for training, advice. Tom's refrigerator was covered with thank you cards from families they'd helped find missing relatives. Photos showed Bruno with rescued hikers, lost children, and elderly people who'd wandered from home. Each image represented a life saved, a family reunited, a crisis resolved. On quiet evenings, Tom would sit by the fire with Bruno and think about that day at the auction. He'd raised his hand to bid on a dog he couldn't really afford, driven by some instinct he didn't understand. That impulsive decision had changed everything. Bruno had taught him that isolation wasn't strength. It was just fear. The dog had shown him that helping others brought meaning to life in ways that solitude never could. And most importantly, Bruno had demonstrated that sometimes the most unexpected relationships become the most important ones. Looking at Bruno now, comfortable and content by the fireplace, Tom marveled at how perfectly everything had worked out. The giant dog, who'd seemed like too much trouble for most people, had turned out to be exactly what Tom needed. Not just a pet or companion, but a partner who would help him find his way back to the world. As another winter approached on Pine Ridge, Tom looked forward to it with excitement rather than resignation. There would be more rescues, more people to help, more opportunities to use the partnership he and Bruno had built. The mountain was still his home, but he wasn't hiding from the world anymore. Thanks to a giant dog with an even bigger heart, Tom had learned that the best way to live wasn't in isolation, it was in service to others. And every day brought new proof that sometimes the most life-changing purchases are the ones you make without thinking, driven by nothing more than instinct and hope. Bruno had been worth far more than the $80 Tom paid at that auction. The dog had been priceless, a gift that transformed a bitter hermit into someone who saved lives, built friendships, and made a difference in the world. And it all started with one impulsive bid on a dog that nobody else wanted. The man who had once avoided people now couldn't imagine life without them. And the dog who had once been afraid of mountain sounds had become the mountain's greatest hero. Together, they'd found their